A struggling father helps his elderly neighbor with a small act of kindness, never expecting that she would repay him in a way that would change his life forever. Mark Carter sighed as he pulled into his driveway, shutting off the engine of his beat-up old truck. His hands were calloused from odd jobs that barely covered the bills, and his mind was weighed down with worries. His daughter's school fees, overdue rent, and the endless cycle of rejection emails from job applications. As he stepped out, he noticed his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, struggling with her broken fence. The wooden planks leaned dangerously, some barely hanging on. She was trying to hammer a nail into place, but her frail hands trembled with the effort. Mark hesitated. He had his own problems. But leaving an old woman to struggle alone? That wasn't who he was. With a sigh, he walked over. "Mrs. Henderson, let me help you with that." The elderly woman turned, surprised. "Oh, Mark, I wouldn't want to trouble you, dear." He shook his head. "It's no trouble. Looks like that fence has seen better days." She chuckled. "Much like me." Mark got to work, hammering in loose planks, reinforcing weak spots, and securing the posts. What he thought would take a few minutes turned into an hour, but he didn't mind. Mrs. Henderson sat on the porch, watching him work, occasionally chatting about her late husband and how he used to fix things around the house. When he finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans. "That should hold for a while." Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled with gratitude. "You didn't have to do that, Mark. I know times are tough for you." He shrugged. "We all need a little help sometimes." She smiled knowingly, but said nothing. What Mark didn't realize was that Mrs. Henderson wasn't just an ordinary elderly woman, and the next time he saw her, she would have an unbelievable surprise waiting for him, one that would change his life forever. The next morning, Mark was jolted awake by the sound of his phone ringing. Groggy, he grabbed it from the nightstand. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello?" he answered, rubbing his eyes. "Is this Mark Carter?" a polished voice asked. Yeah. Who's this?" "My name is William Prescott. I'm the senior director at Henderson and Prescott Real Estate." Mark frowned. "Henderson." The name sounded familiar. "I was given your contact by Mrs. Eleanor Henderson," the man continued. "She told me you're a hard-working man with carpentry and handyman skills." Mark sat up, fully awake now. Yeah, I do a bit of everything." "Well," Prescott said, "Mrs. Henderson happens to be the co-founder of our company, and she spoke very highly of you. She believes a man with your work ethic deserves a real opportunity." Mark's jaw nearly dropped. "I have a job opening in my maintenance and renovations department," Prescott continued. "Full-time, with benefits. If you're interested, I'd like you to come in for an interview this afternoon." Mark blinked. "Wait. Mrs. Henderson owns a real estate company." Prescott chuckled. "Not just any company, one of the largest in the state." Mark was speechless. He had thought of Mrs. Henderson as just a kind old woman struggling with her fence. He never imagined she had powerful connections. "So?" Prescott asked. "Are you interested?" Mark swallowed the lump in his throat, trying to process what was happening. Yeah, he stammered. "I'll be there." As he ended the call, Mark sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the phone in disbelief. Yesterday, he was a struggling father wondering how to make ends meet. Today? Because of one act of kindness, his entire life was about to change. Mark stood in front of the office building of Henderson and Prescott Real Estate, still trying to wrap his head around what was happening. Just yesterday, he was struggling to pay bills, and now he was walking into an interview for a full-time job at one of the biggest real estate companies in the state, all because he had helped fix a fence. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The lobby was sleek, modern, and filled with professionals in expensive suits. He suddenly felt out of place in his worn-out button-up shirt, but he shook off the doubt. Mrs. Henderson believed in him. A receptionist greeted him warmly. "Mr. Carter, right? Mr. Prescott is expecting you." She led him to a spacious office where William Prescott, a tall man in his 50s with a firm handshake, stood waiting. "Mark," he said, gesturing for him to sit, "I've heard great things about you." Mark chuckled nervously. "All from Mrs. Henderson, I'm guessing?" Prescott smiled. "She doesn't speak highly of just anyone. She told me you're hard-working, honest, and skilled with your hands. That's exactly the kind of person we need." Mark listened carefully as Prescott explained the job, a full-time position in the maintenance and renovation division. It included steady pay, benefits, and even opportunities to grow within the company. It was everything he had been praying for. "I won't lie to you, Mark," Prescott said. "This is a big step up from what you've been doing. The work will be demanding, and the standards are high. But after what Mrs. Henderson told me, I have no doubt you're up for it." Mark swallowed, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had spent so much time feeling invisible, struggling to get anyone to give him a chance. Now, because of one small act of kindness, he was sitting across from a man offering him a life-changing opportunity. Prescott leaned forward. "So, what do you say?" Mark didn't hesitate. "I say, when do I start?" Prescott grinned and extended his hand. "Welcome to the team." As Mark shook his hand, a weight lifted from his shoulders. He had spent years struggling, barely getting by. But one good deed had come full circle, and it had just changed his life forever. That evening, Mark sat on his porch, staring at the contract in his hands. A full-time job, a steady paycheck, benefits. It almost didn't feel real. His daughter, Lily, came outside, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Daddy, why are you smiling like that?" Mark chuckled, pulling her onto his lap. "Because, sweetheart, things are finally looking up." She frowned. "Does that mean you won't be sad anymore?" Mark's chest tightened. He had tried to hide his struggles from her, but kids always noticed more than adults gave them credit for. He kissed the top of her head. "No, baby. It means Daddy won't have to worry so much anymore." Just then, he noticed Mrs. Henderson walking toward his porch with a small plate covered in foil. Mark stood up. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't even know what to say." She smiled warmly. "Then don't say anything, dear. Just accept my gratitude." She handed him the plate. "It's my famous homemade apple pie. A little something to celebrate your new beginning." Mark chuckled. "You didn't have to do all this for me." She patted his hand gently. "Mark, kindness has a way of coming back to us when we least expect it. You fixed my fence without hesitation, expecting nothing in return. That told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man you are." Mark swallowed hard, emotion threatening to rise in his throat. "You changed my life, Mrs. Henderson." She smiled knowingly. "No, dear. You changed your own life. I just made sure the right people saw it." As Mrs. Henderson walked back home, Mark looked down at his daughter, his reason for everything. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was barely surviving. For the first time, he had hope. And all it took was one simple act of kindness.